Cheap electric heaters look powerful because they blow warm air instantly, and that's where most people get fooled. Feeling warm up close is not the same thing as heating a room. And once you understand that, a lot of heater advertising stops making sense. Every winter, people buy these expecting real heat, lower bills, and safe overnight use, and end up disappointed or worse. In this video, I'll show you the few numbers that actually matter, the claims you should ignore, and when a cheap heater does and doesn't make sense. The goal is simple. Don't waste money, and don't buy something that can't do the job you expect. This looks powerful, but it isn't. Most cheap electric heaters sell themselves in the first 5 seconds. You plug them in, they start blowing warm air immediately, and your brain checks the box. This works. That instant feedback is convincing, especially when you're cold and just want relief. The heater feels responsive, active, and effective. Here's the catch. That warm air tells you almost nothing about whether the heater can actually heat a room. It only tells you that a heating element is warming the air right in front of it. That's a local effect, not room heating. You can prove this to yourself easily. Stand close to one of these heaters and you'll feel fine. Then step back a few feet and notice how quickly the warmth disappears. Heating a room is about sustained output over time. It's not about how warm the air feels for a moment. It's about how much heat energy the heater can continuously push into the space to overcome heat loss through walls, windows, and doors. Small heaters usually have small elements, limited airflow, and low overall power, which means they can create a warm stream but not a warm environment. This is why people get stuck in the same loop every winter. The heater feels promising at first, so they keep running it, expecting the room to catch up. 10 or 20 minutes later, the space still feels cold. The heater is still running, and nothing has really changed. The heater isn't broken. It's doing exactly what its size and power allow. That first impression is also why advertising leans so hard on speed and immediacy. Words like instant, fast, and powerful focus your attention on how the heater feels up close, not on what it can sustain over time. Once you separate those two ideas, it becomes much easier to judge every other claim that comes after. And that matters, because the next thing most people rely on isn't how the heater works at all. It's the language used to make it sound smarter than it really is. The word ceramic doesn't mean what you think. Once a heater has passed that first impression test, the next thing most people rely on is the language on the box. One word shows up again and again, and that word is ceramic. It sounds modern, efficient, and technical, which makes it feel like you're buying something smarter than a basic heater. Here's the translation. Ceramic doesn't describe how much heat a heater produces. It doesn't make it stronger, cheaper to run, or better at warming a space. It simply describes the type of material used around the heating element. At the power levels most cheap heaters run at, that material choice doesn't change what the heater can realistically do. The reason the word gets pushed so hard is because it sounds like an upgrade. Pair it with phrases like efficient heating or advanced design, and it creates the sense that something clever is happening internally. But nothing about the ceramic label changes the fundamental limits of the heater. The output is still tied to its power, and that ceiling doesn't move. This is where buyers get quietly misled. They assume ceramic means better performance for the same energy use, when in practice, a low-powered ceramic heater behaves like any other low-powered electric heater. It can feel warm up close, it can run quietly, but it still struggles once it's asked to do more. Then spot heating. Once you stop treating ceramic as a feature and start treating it as a description, a lot of heater listings lose their appeal, and that shift makes the next claim stand out immediately, especially when the box starts telling you how much space the heater is supposed to handle. If it says, heats large rooms, be suspicious. Room size claims are where cheap electric heaters make their boldest promises, because numbers sound official. Phrases like, heats large rooms, ideal for living spaces, or specific square foot figures feel reassuring, especially when you don't have an easy reference point to judge them. It sounds like someone has done the math for you, so you don't have to. The problem is that those claims rarely describe real-world performance. They're often based on ideal conditions, short test periods, or assumptions that ignore how homes actually behave in winter. Heat escapes constantly through walls, windows, ceilings, and door gaps, and a heater has to replace that lost heat continuously just to maintain temperature. None of that complexity shows up in a single line on a product page. A simple way to think about it is scale. Heating a large space requires sustained output, not brief bursts of warmth. A small, lightweight heater can add heat to the air directly in front of it, but spreading that heat across an entire room is a different job altogether. The moment the warm air moves away from the heater, it starts losing energy to the surrounding space. This is why people leave these heaters running longer than they planned. The heater stays on, the air near it feels warm, and the expectation is that the room will eventually catch up. In most cases, it never does. The heater isn't failing, and nothing is broken. It's simply operating within limits that don't match the promise printed on the box. That's also why room size claims are such a useful warning sign. If a heater is small enough to pick up easily, store in a drawer, or move from socket to socket, it's worth questioning how it's supposed to overcome heat loss in a large space for hours at a time. The claim isn't there to describe realistic use. It's there to set expectations before you've had a chance to think it through. And when those expectations don't line up with reality, another promise usually steps in to fill the gap. The idea that the heater can somehow do all of this while using very little electricity. Low energy usually means low heat. After big room claims start to sound questionable, energy efficiency is usually the next thing people cling to. Cheap electric heaters are often framed as a way to stay comfortable without watching your electricity bill climb, and labels like low energy, energy saving, or efficient heating make them feel like a sensible compromise. The promise is simple and attractive: enough heat to stay warm, without the cost normally associated with electric heating. What rarely gets explained is that electric heaters don't vary much in efficiency at all. Almost all the electricity they draw is already being converted directly into heat. There's no exhaust heat disappearing up a vent, no combustion losses, and no clever internal process that magically stretches power further. In practical terms, two electric heaters using the same amount of electricity will produce roughly the same amount of heat, regardless of how modern or advanced one of them sounds. This is where the wording starts to cause confusion. When a heater is described as low energy, it doesn't mean it has found a smarter way to heat your space. It simply means it uses less electricity overall. And using less electricity always comes with a trade-off: less heat being produced. That relationship is fixed, and no amount of branding can change it. In real use, this is why so many low-energy heaters feel underwhelming after the first few minutes. Sitting close to one, you might feel fine, especially if the room is small or already partially warm. Over time, though, it becomes obvious that the heater isn't adding enough heat to keep the space comfortable on its own. The room never quite reaches the temperature you expected, and the heater ends up running constantly, just to maintain the same conditions. This is also where cost expectations quietly flip. A heater that runs all the time, because it lacks output, doesn't always end up being cheap to use, even if its individual power draw is low. Instead of short, effective heating cycles, you get long run times with modest results. The savings people expect from the low energy label often don't show up in the way they imagined. Read correctly. Low energy isn't a selling point by itself. It's a limitation that needs to match the job you have in mind. For short bursts of personal warmth, that limitation might be acceptable. For heating a space for hours at a time, it quickly becomes the reason the heater struggles. And when heaters are pushed to operate continuously like that, performance stops being the only thing that matters. How safely they handle long run times, heat buildup, and placement becomes just as important, which is where the next issue comes into play. Small doesn't mean safe. A compact heater often feels less risky simply because it looks less serious. Cheap electric heaters are small, lightweight, and visually unobtrusive, which makes them feel easier to live with than older, bulkier models. They don't dominate a room, they don't look industrial, and they don't immediately trigger the same caution people associate with larger heating appliances. That visual comfort is misleading. Safety has very little to do with a heater's external size, and almost everything to do with what's happening inside it while it's running. Internal components still heat up, electrical connections still carry load, and airflow still has to remove heat fast enough to prevent buildup. In cheaper heaters, those systems are often designed to meet the bare minimum required to pass certification, not to handle ideal conditions over long periods of real use. Time is one of the biggest stress factors. As a heater runs continuously, internal temperatures rise and stay elevated. Plastic housings warm, small fans operate nonstop, and components are pushed closer to their limits. In lower-cost designs, wiring tends to be thinner, thermal cutoffs are simpler, and overall tolerance for heat buildup is lower. Nothing may happen immediately, but the margin for error is smaller the longer the heater stays on. Placement makes this even more important. Small heaters are easy to tuck into corners, place near furniture, or slide under desks, often without much thought about airflow. A blocked vent, a curtain brushing the casing, or dust buildup inside the unit can all change how heat moves through the heater. Because the unit is quiet and compact, these changes often go unnoticed. Unattended use adds another layer of risk. Leaving a heater running overnight or while you're out of the room means there's no one there to notice unusual smells, sounds, or changes in performance. Cheap heaters aren't automatically dangerous, but they are less forgiving when conditions aren't ideal, and problems escalate faster when no one is paying attention. If this breakdown is helping you avoid bad buys, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel. Looking at safety this way shifts the buying mindset. It's no longer just about whether a heater works, but how it will realistically be used day to day. How long will it run? Where will it sit? What happens if airflow isn't perfect? Once those questions enter the decision, another issue starts to stand out. The fact that many of these heaters are sold as if they're all basically the same, even when their prices aren't. They only work if you use them the right way. A lot of frustration around cheap electric heaters doesn't come from the heaters themselves, but from how they're expected to perform. Advertising often frames them as compact replacements for proper heating systems, which quietly sets people up for disappointment. When a heater is sold as something it isn't, even a perfectly functional unit can feel like a bad purchase. These heaters make the most sense when they're used for short-range, personal warmth rather than whole-room heating, sitting under a desk, keeping your legs or feet warm while you work, or taking the edge off a cold spot when you're staying in one place, are situations where cheap heaters can actually do a reasonable job. In those cases, you're close enough to feel the heat directly, and you're not asking the heater to fight heat loss across an entire space. Problems begin when that limited role quietly turns into a bigger expectation. Using a cheap heater as a primary heat source, leaving it running all day, or expecting it to warm a bedroom or living room puts it in a position it was never designed for. The heater ends up running continuously. The room temperature barely changes, and the gap between what you expected and what you're getting becomes hard to ignore. This is also where cost and safety concerns start to overlap. A heater that runs non-stop because it lacks the output to keep up is under constant stress, and any savings you expected from buying something cheap or low energy begin to disappear. Longer runtimes mean more wear, more heat buildup, and higher overall energy use than people often anticipate. Using these heaters the right way comes down to setting realistic boundaries. A basic heater can be perfectly adequate for personal comfort in a small area when it's used sensibly, placed with good airflow, and turned off when it's no longer needed. It stops making sense when it's expected to replace proper heating or operate unattended for long periods. Once that distinction is clear, frustration tends to fade. You stop judging the heater by what it was advertised to do and start judging it by what it's actually capable of. And when expectations finally line up with reality, another question naturally comes to the surface: whether the price you're being asked to pay for that limited role is actually fair. You're probably overpaying for the same heater. Once expectations finally line up with what cheap electric heaters can realistically do, price becomes the next place people get caught out. Many of these heaters are sold as if they're unique products, each with their own branding, story, and list of features, even though the heater itself hasn't really changed. This is how someone can pay very different prices for devices that are functionally identical. Rebranding is the key to making this work. A new name, a slightly different shape, or a different color scheme is often enough to make a heater feel like a separate product. Marketing language does the rest, using small wording changes to suggest improvements that don't actually exist. When you start seeing the same size, layout, controls, and overall design repeated across different listings, it's usually because the internal components are the same. This is especially common online, where comparison is harder than it should be. A heater sold on one site might look like a budget option, while the same heater on another site is framed as a premium product with a higher starting price and a dramatic discount. To the buyer, it feels like a choice between quality levels, when it's really a choice between different presentations of the same thing. Pricing tactics push this even further. A heater that might seem fairly ordinary at a modest price suddenly feels like a bargain when it's presented as 60% off, a winter special, or a limited time deal. Countdown timers, low stock warnings, and phrases like selling fast create urgency and encourage people to act quickly, often before they've had time to compare similar products side by side. What's important to understand is that those higher prices are often artificial to begin with. The original price isn't there to reflect value, it's there to anchor your expectations. The discount feels meaningful only because the starting number was inflated. Paying more doesn't get you better performance, improved safety, or longer lifespan. It just means the framing worked. Once you recognize this pattern, buying becomes much less stressful. You stop chasing perceived value created by discounts and start focusing on what the heater actually is and what role it's meant to play. At that point, urgency loses its power, and the final decision becomes much clearer. Whether a cheap electric heater is worth buying at all, or whether walking away is the smarter move. Here's how to decide before you buy. At this point, the decision around cheap electric heaters should feel clearer, not heavier. The mistake most people make is trying to judge these products based on how persuasive the advertising is or how many features are listed on the box. A better way to decide is to ignore the marketing completely and start with one simple question. What job do I actually need this heater to do? If the job is personal warmth, a cheap electric heater can make sense. Sitting at a desk, working in a cold corner, or staying in one place for a long period are situations where direct heat matters more than changing the temperature of the whole room. In those cases, the heater isn't fighting the space around it, it's just warming you. When that's the expectation, small heaters can be useful as long as they're placed sensibly and used for limited periods. If the job is room heating, the answer changes quickly. Raising the temperature of a bedroom, living room, or open space requires sustained output and airflow that compact, low-powered heaters aren't built to provide. That's not a failure of design or a bad brand choice. It's a mismatch between the product and the task. Expecting a small heater to take over that role almost always leads to frustration. This is where a simple decision rule helps cut through everything else. If a heater promises low energy use and whole room heating at the same time, it isn't offering a clever solution, it's offering optimism. And optimism isn't something you want to rely on when cost, comfort, and safety are involved. Once you approach the decision this way, a lot of pressure disappears. You're no longer comparing models, discounts, or feature lists. You're deciding whether the category itself fits what you need. If it does, you know what to prioritize and what to ignore. If it doesn't, walking away is the smartest option. That's the real value of watching this first. Not to talk you out of buying something, but to make sure that if you do spend money, it's on a heater that matches the job you expect it to do, without surprises later on. At this point, you should feel confident about the decision, whichever way it goes. If a cheap electric heater makes sense for your situation, you now know exactly why, what to look for, and what to ignore. And if it doesn't, you've probably saved yourself money, frustration, and a few bad assumptions. The goal here was never to say that every cheap heater is bad. It was to make sure you don't buy one expecting it to do something it simply can't. When expectations are clear, the decision becomes straightforward, and there's a lot less room for regret. If this helped you think through the purchase more clearly, like the video and subscribe for more straight, practical buying advice. No hype, no pressure, just help making better decisions before you spend your money.